صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome to officially the first night of Ramadan, but the second night of our MYC IIA English program. I would like to welcome you all and wish you all a happy Ramadan, and may the blessings of this be upon you and your family. I would like to invite our guest speaker, Dr. Sadik Kassem, who needs no introduction to our community. We've had him in the past years. He's well knowledgeable in his field as well as Islam. So we'd like to welcome to the podium Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. لقد جاءت رسل ربنا بالحق ونودوا أن تلكم الجنة ورثتموها بما كنتم تعملون. والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا وحبيب قلوبنا السراج المنير المصطفى الأمجد أبا القاسم محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين وعلى أصحابه الغر الميامين. My dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Before we begin, the folks sitting in the back, if you could move to the front, let's all collect towards the front if we can. There's a big distance between me and the audience, so both the brothers and the sisters, please move to the front after a loud salawat.
اللهم صل على محمد.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Inna al-insana khuliqa halu'a. Right now in the United States, we're in the middle of a tremendous crisis. Not just in the United States, actually globally, humanity is in the middle of a tremendous crisis. And the challenge is that actually this crisis is rarely discussed about. But this crisis that I'm going to discuss here tonight is causing the death of more people than war, natural disasters, and crime combined. This is the disaster that I'm talking about, or the crisis that I'm talking about, is suicide. Globally, the suicide rate across the world is increasing at a tremendous pace. And even in the United States, last year, the suicide rate among all age groups reached a 30-year high. And in fact, the journal Foreign Policy even went on to say that America's suicide epidemic is a national security crisis. It's a crisis. And oftentimes they talk in the media about terrorism, about so-called Islamic terrorism. But the article in Foreign Policy went on to say that actually if you look at the numbers of people that die based on terrorism versus the numbers that die from suicide, there's no comparison. More people are dying in America today than are dying from suicide than are dying from any other of the major leading causes of death. In fact, just to put it into a more sobering real-life number, the CDC, which is the Center for Disease Controls, last year said that it is now more likely for a middle school student to die from suicide as from traffic accidents. So imagine that. In the United States today, it is more likely for a child aged 10 to 14 years old to die from suicide than to die from a traffic accident. So again, I repeat the point. We're in the middle of a tremendous crisis globally, both at a global level and at a national level. And yet the problem is that this crisis is rarely discussed, neither in the mainstream media or in the houses of worship. So tonight what we want to do is we want to talk about the factors that lead to suicide, specifically depression and anxiety. And we want to approach these topics from the following perspective. We want to answer the following questions tonight. What are the causes of anxiety and depression according to both non-Islamic and Islamic sources? And then in the second part, we'll talk about 5 Quranic recommendations to proactively combat anxiety and depression. So that's the discussion for tonight. In the first part, we'll talk about the ultimate causes of anxiety and depression according to both Western medicine and to Islamic sources. And then in the second part, we'll talk about some Quranic recommendations to proactively combat anxiety and depression. But first, please give me a loud salawat. So as I mentioned, we're in the middle of this epidemic, this suicide epidemic. But suicide, if you look at it, is the ultimate outcome of individuals that are facing severe anxiety and depression. When you're in a state of severe depression and anxiety, eventually you reach a point in your existence where existing has no meaning, and therefore you commit the ultimate act of violence, which is violence against yourself. That's what suicide is really the outcome of. It's the outcome of anxiety and depression. But the question becomes, what are the factors that lead to anxiety and depression? What has Western medicine said about the factors that lead to anxiety and depression? Well, in Western medicine, there are actually many different opinions on the causes of anxiety and depression. There's one school of thought that's represented by people like Hippocrates and Aristotle, and they're really representative of the majority of modern medicine today. In this camp, the idea is that anxiety and depression, or mental illness in general, are essentially problems of the mind. And what they really are a cause of, and Hippocrates, who's the famous Western, father of Western medicine, says that if you cut open the head of a mentally ill individual, you will find the brain humid, full of sweat, and smelling badly. Meaning the problem of anxiety and depression, according to people like Aristotle and Hippocrates, is a problem of brain chemistry. There's something fundamentally wrong with the makeup of your brain. And so in modern medicine, this has led to the solution that when your brain has some chemical problem, the way that you solve the chemical problem that leads to anxiety and depression is by giving a chemical solution. So that's one school of thought. The one school of thought thinks that anxiety and depression are an outcome of bad chemical reactions in your brain, and the way to counteract that is through medicine. That's one school of thought. The other school of thought thinks that anxiety and depression are actually problems of logic. And this school of thought is represented by people like Plato and Spinoza, who say that anxiety and depression are really a problem of logic. So meaning that, somehow in your brain, you're unable to think logically. So the solution to anxiety and depression, according to this camp, is something called cognitive behavioral therapy, or essentially psychotherapy. So this is the image that many of us have of psychiatrists. You go to a therapist, you sit on a couch, and you talk with someone, and this expert that you're talking with will hopefully talk you through the logical inconsistencies in your head, and hopefully will resolve your anxiety and depression. So this is the second school of thought. These are the predominant 2 schools of thought in Western medicine today. The school of thought that thinks that anxiety and depression are caused by bad chemical reactions and the solution are drugs, and then the school of thought that thinks that anxiety and depression are caused by faulty logic and the solution is essentially through cognitive behavioral therapy. The problem with these 2 schools of thought is that they're only looking at the individual with regard to their physical composition. And, a lot of these schools of thought actually have a very simplistic overview and are actually very subjective in the way that they practice medicine. So, for example, there was a very interesting map in the New York Times the other day that showed that the way that a doctor will treat you is really dependent on whether you live in a red state or a blue state. So many of you are familiar with the designation red state. These are the more socially conservative states that tend to be more conservative, vote Republican. Doctors in red states tend to prescribe medicine more often than doctors in blue states. Doctors in blue states will solve anxiety and depression through this psychotherapy. So this right there will tell you the problem with how modern medicine today approaches anxiety and depression, is that there are so many different opinions, and the solutions to those opinions really depends on the area that you're living in. Whether you're living in a red state or a blue state, the doctor will treat you and prescribe for you a medicine completely dependent on how they were trained in medicine. Now there's a third school of thought which is represented by Freud. Freud says that anxiety and depression are due to childhood trauma. So maybe you experienced something difficult in your early lifetime. Maybe your mother treated you badly, maybe your father treated you badly, and the reason that you build up anxiety and depression over time is because you have these forgotten memories. And the way to resolve anxiety and depression is essentially to talk through and to confront your parents. So, something, to resolve these, problems, anxiety and depression. So again, the problem with each of these, descriptions of anxiety and depression is that they're very simplistic, and oftentimes the people who are describing these problems themselves had issues with regard to mental illness. So for example, Freud, it's well known that for a period of his lifetime, for 10 years of his life, he was addicted to heroin. So here you have an individual who's presumably studying diseases of the human mind, but he himself has incomplete control of his own mental situation. And this is the problem with the majority of, I would say, Western sort of designated medicine. So within that context, oftentimes people will say, well, okay, Islam is the solution. This is a very easy bumper, sticker slogan. For every problem that exists out there, people will immediately say Islam is the solution. But the problem with just saying Islam is the solution is if you don't nicely articulate the problem, then the solution that you have is not going to, appropriately address the problem. So before bringing out Islam, the Islamic sort of designation, we need to more appropriately understand the problem. In order to apply the solution, you need to have a firm understanding of the problem as it exists. Which leads us to what does Islam say about the causes of depression and anxiety? Before we get into that, please give me a loud salawat. Islam takes a very different perspective in that Islam doesn't believe that anxiety and depression are diseases or mental diseases, but rather anxiety is mankind's natural disposition. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Ma'arij says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Inna al-insana khuliqa halu'a. Mankind was created on a foundation of anxiety. Now many of you will probably step back and say, hold on. We thought that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created mankind in the best shape and form. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَخَلَقَ الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ in Surah Al-Tin, that mankind was created in the best shape and form. So if mankind in Surah Al-Tin was إِنَّا خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ, if mankind was created in the best shape and form, then how is Surah Al-Ma'arij telling us إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ خُلِقَ هَلُوعًا? There seems to be this disconnect. On one hand, Allah is saying that mankind was created in the best shape, but on the other hand, in Surah Al-Ma'arij, Allah is telling us that mankind is created anxious. Well, this is part of the beauty of mankind's creation. Anxiety is actually, in limited doses, something which is tremendously beneficial for the human condition. Because if we don't have anxiety, we'll never have the motivation to actually succeed in life. If we weren't anxious about how we're going to do in terms of our career, we would never feel motivated to actually advance and study and work towards achieving the highest levels of our career trajectory. If we were not anxious about the situation of our family, we would never look out for our children if we have children, or we would never look out for the health and well-being of our parents. So anxiety in limited doses is actually one of the things that has enabled humanity to advance tremendously. But the problem that occurs is anxiety in excessive doses will cause some of these mental diseases. Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala goes on to say, إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ خُلِقَ هَلُوعًا إِذَا مَسَّهُ الشَّرُّ جَزُوعًا وَإِذَا مَسَّهُ الْخَيْرُ مَنُوعًا. We'll get into the explanation of these latter ayahs. So the first thing that we should recognize is that Islam, unlike the Western concepts of anxiety and depression, doesn't feel that anxiety and depression are mental illnesses. But rather, Islam takes the position that anxiety is a fundamental component of man's creation. And depression as well. If you look in the Quran, there are numerous instances of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describing the prophets being in a state of depression. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, tells us about Prophet Yaqub, who says, وَقَالَ يَا أَسَفَ عَلَى يُوسُفَ وَأَبْيَضَّتْ عَيْنَاهُ مِنَ الْحُزْنِ فَهُوَ كَظِيمٌ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that Prophet Yaqub was so overwhelmed with depression over the loss of his young son, Prophet Yusuf, that his eyes became white with the success of depression. So Islam takes the position that anxiety is a natural part of mankind's existence. But the lack of balance, meaning when you allow anxiety and depression to overtake your existence, that's where the problems will come in. So what Islam, in the Quran, the problem that needs to be resolved is not necessarily solved through drugs or through cognitive therapy. But rather the problem is solved by understanding your environment and understanding the triggers that lead to excessive anxiety and to excessive depression. Salawat. So rather than prescribing something very simplistic like some drugs or some psychotherapy, when you look at the description of anxiety and depression in the Quran, and according to the Ahlul Bayt, the thing that they mention to prevent anxiety and depression is to be proactive in terms of putting yourself in the environment and situations that will enable you to maintain some balance without exceeding the natural inclination of exceeding into anxiety and depression. So in the remainder of the talk, I wanted to discuss some of the causes of anxiety and depression as articulated in the Quran, and then actually talk about some solutions. So what are some of the causes? What are some of the environmental triggers that cause us to go into a state of imbalance? Meaning going from the limited amount of anxiety that makes us successful to going into a situation that makes us imbalanced. Well, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq has a beautiful hadith, and I would urge you to look at this hadith, because in this one hadith, I would say there's more truth than the entirety of the theories of Freud, Aristotle, and Hippocrates. It's really a beautiful hadith that really gets to the heart of the matter, of the thing that causes mankind to go into excessive anxiety and depression. Just this one hadith. Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq says, من تعلق قلبه بالدنيا تعلق قلبه بثلاث خصال هم لا يفنى وأمل لا يدرك ورجاء لا ينال. So here Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, he says, whoever has a heart attached to this world will have three things attached to their heart: unremitting sadness, unfulfilled desire, and unachievable hope. Whoever has a heart attached to this world has three things attached to their hearts: unremitting sadness, unfulfilled desire, and unachievable hope. Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq is telling us in one statement the main cause of anxiety and depression in humanity. The main thing that causes mankind to transgress their natural boundaries of balance and to go into a situation where they become unbalanced and go into excessive anxiety and depression It's this unachievable attachment to material things. Because when you look at it, every material thing that you attach your heart to will eventually disappear from the face of this earth. But if you have your hopes and aspirations attached to, let's say, a new BMW, 3 class, or a new iPhone 8, or a new iPod, well, that attachment is going to be very limited in scope, because eventually they're going to come out with an iPhone 9. Eventually they're going to come out with the self-driving BMW. Eventually they're going to come out with a newer model. So what Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq is talking about here is that whenever you attach yourself to something which is transient in nature, your hope and your happiness is going to be transient as well. Your happiness in terms of attachment to that thing will only last as long as the thing is actually in existence. من تعلق قلبه بالدنيا تعلق قلبه بثلاث خصال هم لا يفنى وأمن لا يدرك ورجاء لا ينال. So this was a prediction that was made by Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq over 1400 years ago. The question becomes, was Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq's prediction true? Well, actually there are people who are studying this. There are 2 prominent economists. One of them is at Harvard, named Juliet Schor. She's now at Boston University. The other one is named Tim Kasser. He also is at Harvard, but now he's at the University of Hawaii. They're looking at the impact of excessive materialism on happiness and on an individual's life achievement. And what they've concluded, and what they study is they study young people between the ages of 10 to 18. They call these people the most brand-oriented, consumer-involved, and materialistic generation in history. And what they've concluded in their studies is that this generation actually has the highest levels of anxiety and the highest levels of depression compared to every other generation that's come before. In fact, the New York Times was remarking, remember how I mentioned that there's a 30-year high in terms of the suicide epidemic? The New York Times went on to say that young adolescents are suffering from a range of health problems associated with the country's rapidly changing culture. Meaning it's the culture which is causing people to be excessively anxious and depressed. And this culture is oftentimes, really manifested or really represented by this excessive attachment to material goods. The American economy is a consumer-based economy. Something like 70% of the economy is dependent on us continually spending. So obviously, if you're raised in this type of environment, your main desire and motivation in life is going to be to continue to spend. Well, this has a limit. Mankind was not created to just simply spend and consume. Mankind was created for a higher purpose. And that's what Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq is talking about here. من تعلق قلبه بالدنيا تعلق قلبه بثلاث خصال. Now, what is, the first cause of, we would say, excessive anxiety and depression is this excessive attachment to the material things of this world, which are ultimately very temporal, very temporary, and will never, live up to your expectations and to your hopes. In fact, Imam Ali alayhi salam says that cheerfulness, al-talaqatu shimatul hur, cheerfulness is the distinguishing trait of the free. What does Imam Ali mean by that? He means that the individuals who are the happiest are the ones who are the freest from material obligations. You'll notice who's the happiest individuals that you can think of in your life. They're young kids, right? Why are young children so happy? Because they're not burdened with car payments. They're not burdened with buying the latest from Sephora, I guess, right? That's probably bad, or the latest, from Gucci. I mean, there's no problem with buying those things, but when that becomes your prime motivation in life, then that really weighs you down. When Imam Ali says, freedom is the cheerfulness is the sign of the free. What he's talking about is individuals who are free from these material shackles that are essentially weighing us down. So what Islam would say in the first part is that anxiety and depression are not mental illnesses, but rather they're the outcome of being affected by the environment around you. Which leads us to the second cause of excessive anxiety and depression, which is beautifully articulated in the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَمَنْ أَعْرَضَ عَنْ ذِكْرِي فَإِنَّ لَهُ مَعِيشَةً ضَنْكًا وَنَحْشُرُهُ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ أَعْمَى. And whoever avoids my remembrance, فَلَهُ مَعِيشَةً ضَنْكًا, will live a very narrow, very depressed, very anxious life. وَمَنْ أَعْرَضَ عَنْ ذِكْرِي فَإِنَّ لَهُ مَعِيشَةً ضَنْكًا. Whoever avoids my remembrance will live a very depressed and a very narrow life. وَنَحْشُرُهُ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ أَعْمَى. And on the day of judgment, we're going to cause them to be resurrected blind. So what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioning here is a fundamental component of our existence. Mankind was created based on the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when we're taken out of the situation of continual remembrance, we're put in unnatural positions that cause us to feel excessive anxiety and depression. Now this is really an interesting ayah, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَنْ أَعْرَضَ عَنْ ذِكْرِ, meaning the supposition here is that mankind's default position is the remembrance of Allah. And it's the environment that takes mankind away from the remembrance of Allah. This is interesting because actually there's been some really interesting studies from this psychologist at Boston University named Deborah Kellerman. And what she studies is she studies young kids, from infants up to the age of 13. What she's found is that infants all the way up to the age of 10 seem to have this natural disposition to believe in God. Meaning up until the age of 10, young kids have this natural inclination to believe in a higher being. And even if the kids come from an atheist household, what Deborah Kellerman has found is that children, from the time that they're born all the way until the time they reach the age of 10, whenever you ask them, for example, where did this rock come from? Or where did this tree come from? Across the board, children will respond, it came from God, or it came from a higher power. That's the way that children are sort of created. But something happens at the age of 10 that Deborah Kellerman noticed. At the age of 10, children start making their own decisions and they become more affected by the environment. So their belief in God over time starts to decrease. So it seems that mankind's natural disposition is towards the belief in God. But over time, when they become impacted by the surrounding environment, which takes them away from the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or for the Almighty, they become less likely to believe in a higher power. And within this context, the factor that's probably leading to the most lack of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually the most dangerous weapon. It's actually in our pockets. It's this telephone right here. This device is arguably taking us away from the remembrance of Allah, whether we believe in this statement or not. In fact, don't just take my word for it. MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where a lot of these technologies were developed, recently came out with a study. And the title of the study was, How the Internet is Changing America's Religion. How the Internet is Changing America's Religion. And what the scholars at MIT did is they looked at the increase in the usage of the Internet, and what they were able to link it to is with a decrease in terms of attendance with religious congregations and just belief in God. They say that they find this causative link, that the more an individual uses the Internet, the less likely they are to believe in God. وَمَنْ أَعْرَضَ عَنْ ذِكْرِي فَإِنَّ لَهُ مَعِيشَةً ضَنْكًا. The thing which is taking us away from the remembrance of Allah, although the Internet and social media has tremendous powers, it also has tremendous negative powers, which is really demonstrated in the lack of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in fact, the way that we use the Internet is really changing us as individuals and as society. Just to give you an idea, there's this recent really great book by a professor at NYU called Irresistible: The Rise of Addictive Technologies and How They Keep Us Hooked. And what this professor has done is really written a beautiful book about the impact of the internet on human behavior. And one of the things that he mentions very interestingly is, many of the people who've developed these devices, like Steve Jobs, for example, Steve Jobs never allowed his children to own an iPhone. He never allowed his children to own an iPod or an iPad. And the reason for that is because he thought that it would fundamentally change the way they behave as individuals. Steve Jobs was not a Muslim, he was not a believer in God, but he, as the creator of this technology, recognized the awesome power that this technology has on human behavior and human interaction. These technologies are fundamentally changing us as humans. And in fact, I'll just give you one example. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ نَسُوا اللَّهَ فَأَنْسَاهُمْ أَنفُسَهُمْ, and do not be like those who forgot Allah, so Allah made them forget themselves. The thing about these technologies is they keep us addicted to continual usage. So, there's some apps that I would urge you to download. Yeah, I'm talking against the iPhone, but I'm telling you to download an app. But actually, this is a helpful app. This app is called Moment. So if you download this app, it'll tell you how many times a day you pick up your phone. And when I downloaded the app, I was really, both shocked and, surprised at how many times I checked my phone. And the thing is, a lot of times we check these devices throughout the day and we're completely unconscious of how many times we check them. But if you actually start monitoring your behavior, you'll become surprised at how much time and how much effort you spend on these devices compared to everything else in your life. And these devices have really changed human behavior as well. In this book by Adam Alter, he talks about how these devices have changed our attention span. So all of you are familiar with the concept of an attention span, right? An attention span is essentially the amount of time that you spend focused on something. So what they found in these studies is 10 years ago, when the iPad was first launched, the average human, their attention span was 12 seconds. Meaning we had the ability to focus on something for 12 seconds at a time. But after 10 years, so 10 years after the release of the iPad, our attention span has now decreased to around 8 seconds. So it's gone in 10 years from 12 seconds to 8 seconds. So you may say, well, that's still good, right? 8 seconds, that seems like a good attention span. Well, just to put it into a frame of reference, the average goldfish has an attention span of 9 seconds. So our attention span is less than that of an average goldfish. So right now I'm talking to all of you, but if I was talking to goldfish, I'd probably, be doing better. But I'll salawat. So the point being that in modern times, these technologies have altered the way that our brains function. And this change in our brain function has led us away from our default position, which is the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Remember, فَقِمْ وَجْهَكَ لِلدِّينِ حَنِيفًا فَطَرَةَ اللَّهُ الَّتِي فَطَرَ النَّاسَ عَلَيْهَا لَا تَبْدِيلَ لِخَلْقِ اللَّهِ. Mankind's natural disposition is the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Mankind was created upon a foundation of remembrance. But it's the environment that causes us to avoid the remembrance of Allah. And it's this avoidance of the remembrance of Allah that leads to excessive anxiety and excessive depression. وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ نَسُوا اللَّهَ فَأَنْسَاهُمْ أَنفُسَهُمْ أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْفَاسِقُونَ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us very clearly, do not be like those who forgot Allah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made them forget themselves. And this ayah is really the essence. This ayah, although it also describes the problem, it also describes the solution for avoiding excessive anxiety and depression. We'll get into that, but first please give me a lot of salawat. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ نَسُوا اللَّهَ فَأَنْسَاهُمْ أَنفُسَهُمْ. And do not become like those who forgot Allah, so Allah made them forget themselves. You see here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is connecting self-knowledge with knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you want to get a control of your anxiety and depression, first and foremost, you've got to know yourself. And if you want to know yourself, first and foremost, you've got to know the Creator who created yourself. Self-knowledge is linked to knowledge of the Almighty. And knowledge of the Almighty is linked to knowledge of the self. These two are interconnected. And the problem that we have in everyday life is that our knowledge or our awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is oftentimes diverted. Or it's, it becomes, taken over by different things. Which is where the month of Ramadan comes in. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا كتب عليكم الصيام كما كتب على الذين من قبلكم لعلكم تتقون. Fasting was prescribed for you, as it was prescribed for those before you, so that you may gain God consciousness. Because it's in this fact of gaining God consciousness that you'll reconnect with your true self. It's when you connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you become more connected to your own desires and aspirations and hopes outside of daily life. That's why, Siyam is really, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a beautiful hadith Qudsi where He says, As-siyamu li wa ana ujzi bih. That fasting is for me and I will reward it. Siyam is the only act of worship where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has very directly linked it to being for Him completely. And this is what the month of Ramadan makes us aware of. The solution, first and foremost, is, it allows us to understand the limitations of our own material self and really address the needs of our spiritual self. Because as Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq says, مَثَلِ الدُّنْيَا كَمَثَلِ مَاءِ الْبَحْرِ كُلَّمَا شَرِبَ مِنْهُ الْعَطْشَانَ أَزْدَادَ عَطَشًا حَتَّى يَقْتُلُهُ. So the example of this life is like the example of the seawater. The more a thirsty person drinks from it, the thirstier they become until it kills them. So what Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq is saying here is that this world, many of us have desires and hopes. But oftentimes we fill those desires and hopes with something that actually ends up harming us more than helping us. And what Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq is saying here is that this world is like the seawater. How many of you have drunk seawater? Seawater is not something that will quench thirst. It temporarily maybe quenches the thirst, but it's not something that you can live on. It's not like the sweet water. What Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq is saying is that the example of this life is like the example of the seawater. The more you drink of it, the thirstier you become until it ends up killing you. So that's what this world is teaching us on a daily basis. Whereas during the month of Ramadan, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us an opportunity to recognize the higher aspect of our existence, which is beyond the material aspect. So, what are the solutions to avoiding excessive anxiety and depression? In Surah Al-Ma'arij again, we talked about this. إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ خُلِقَ هَلُوعًا. Mankind was created in a state of anxiety. إِذَا مَسَّهُ الشَّرُّ جَزُوعًا وَإِذَا مَسَّهُ الْخَيْرُ مَنُوعًا. If hardship falls on mankind, they freak out. إِذَا مَسَّهُ الشَّرُّ جَزُوعًا وَإِذَا مَسَّهُ الْخَيْرُ مَنُوعًا. But when good things happen to mankind, they become very stingy. Notice how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about the causes of anxiety. He says, إِذَا مَسَّهُ الشَّرُّ جَزُوعًا. When a hardship or when a difficulty happens to mankind, they freak out. Jazua. Allah uses the word jazua, which is a very, heightened word. Jazua. إِذَا مَسَّهُ الشَّرُّ جَزُوعًا وَإِذَا مَسَّهُ الْخَيْرُ. But when good times happen to him, manua, he becomes stingy. Have you ever encountered these people where, they're always complaining? Every time you ask them, how's it going, my dear brother? How's it going, my dear sister? Oh, I'm having some back problems. I'm having difficulty at work. This is happening. They're always complaining. But when something good happens to them, And then you ask them, oh, well, listen, I saw that you bought a new car. Maybe we can go to, grab a bite to eat or something. They'll say, oh, no, brother, I can't, go in my car. It'll put too much mileage on me, right? إِذَا مَسَّهُ الْخَيْرُ مَنُوعًا. When good things happen to him, he becomes stingy. He starts holding back. So the solution to excessive anxiety and depression is to proactively volunteer of your time and effort. Volunteer of the things that are the most precious to you. Because if you hold these things to be dear to you, it's going to be very difficult to give them away. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالَّذِينَ فِي أَمْوَالِهِمْ حَقٌّ مَعْلُومٌ لِلسَّائِلِ وَالْمَحْرُومِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala goes on to say, بَلَى مَنْ أَسْلَمَ وَجْهَهُ لِلَّهِ وَهُوَ مُحْسِنٌ فَلَهُ أَجْرَهُ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِ وَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. He says, whoever, بَلَى مَنْ أَسْلَمَ وَجْهَهُ لِلَّهِ, whoever submits their existence totally to the worship of Allah. بَلَى مَنْ أَسْلَمَ وَجْهَهُ لِلَّهِ وَهُوَ مُحْسِنٌ, and he does good deeds and he does beautiful things. فَلَهُ أَجْرَهُ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِ, will have his reward with the Almighty. وَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ, and they will have no fear. وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ, and they will never be in a state of anxiety and depression. Notice what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying here. He's linking the ability of proactively volunteering your time and effort with a lack of anxiety and depression. And by the way, they've done numerous studies. They have this thing called the volunteer's high, that when people volunteer, it ends up actually being more beneficial than if they take some of these antidepressants. So if you take something like Prozac or Valium, there's certain instances where these things are required. But actually, if you want to be more proactive about combating anxiety, just go and volunteer at your local soup kitchen, or volunteer here in the masjid, or volunteer at WISE, or volunteer at Zaman International, or volunteer at the dozens of organizations that are here in existence. This is a proactive way to combat anxiety and depression, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying. And then, there are many other solutions. The time is limited. I just wanted to, close with this final solution for combating anxiety and depression, which is to have good friends and companions. Arguably, the environment that we put ourselves in has the biggest impact on our mental health and well-being. So if we hang out with individuals who are continually pessimistic about life, if we hang out with individuals who are continually, impatient, we by extension are going to be impatient and anxious and depressed. But if we hang out with individuals who are continually proactive in terms of their servitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in terms of their connection with Allah, this is something that will benefit us. That's why Imam Ali alayhi salam says, "Man la sadiqa lah, la dhukhra lah." He who lacks friends lacks a bare necessity. So, in addition to volunteering your time and effort, in addition to, enabling this God consciousness as we have during the month of Ramadan, one of the best solutions for combating anxiety and depression, or excessive anxiety and depression, is to have good friends that can always keep you in a state of balance. Friends that can keep you balanced and, in a state of good conduct, and not friends that will take you into excessive anxiety. So, this was a very brief discussion here tonight of the causes of anxiety and depression. As I mentioned, the United States is today in the middle of a tremendous epidemic, the suicide epidemic. More people are dying from suicide than are dying of many of the other fatalities. America's suicide epidemic is now at a 30-year high. The solutions are really provided, through various aspects of the Quran. But first and foremost, the month of Ramadan is really step one towards combating anxiety and depression. Because when one has God consciousness, this enables them to now have self-consciousness. And the step one to combating anxiety and depression is to be aware of your own weaknesses, of your own strengths, and to proactively address those. So I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to enable us to become servants of Allah both during this month and during the subsequent months. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to enable the God consciousness that we earn during this month to continue throughout the months and throughout the years, and to enable us to become servants of Allah and servants of Ahlul Bayt. ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا وأخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. صلوات.
صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Thank you, Dr. Sanda, for that beautiful lecture. You know, this is not a topic that's usually addressed, and it's not just an issue in this community, in communities worldwide. So can we have another loud salat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad?